The sun hung low over Cedar Falls, painting the dusty streets in shades of amber and rust. It was the kind of evening that made the Arizona Territory look almost gentle, though Wallace McCain knew better. This land had teeth, and it showed them to anyone foolish enough to forget. He guided his bay mare down the main thoroughfare, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves mixing with the distant sounds of the saloon's piano. Wallace kept his hat pulled low, a habit formed over years of preferring shadows to spotlight. At 42, he cut a figure that commanded respect without demanding it, broad shoulders that spoke of hard work, hands scarred from rope and reins, and eyes the color of winter sky that missed little but revealed less. Most folks in Cedar Falls thought they knew Wallace McCain, a middling rancher with a modest spread east of town. They'd say, kept to himself mostly, came in for supplies every other week, paid his bills on time. What they didn't know, what Wallace had spent considerable effort ensuring they never would know, was that beneath his work-worn boots lay a fortune in silver certificates, hidden away since his days in the Tombstone mines nearly 15 years past. The weight of that secret had grown comfortable over time, like a well-worn saddle. He'd learned early that wealth attracted vultures faster than a carcass in the desert. Better to live simple, live quiet, and keep the past buried deeper than any mine shaft. As he passed the mercantile, Wallace's attention was drawn to a small crowd gathered near the general store, their voices carried on the evening air, sharp with the particular tone of righteous indignation that small towns perfected like a craft. "Shameful is what it is," declared Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, her voice cutting through the murmur like a rusty saw. "Acting all high and mighty when we all know she's just waiting for the next fool to come along." Wallace slowed his mare, though every instinct told him to keep riding. Getting involved in town gossip was like stepping in quicksand. The more you struggled, the deeper you sank. Through the gathering, he caught sight of the subject of their scorn. Lillian Shaw stood on the wooden sidewalk outside her late husband's store, her spine straight as a rifle barrel despite the verbal assault. She couldn't have been more than 28, Wallace figured, though grief had a way of adding years to a person's face. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her gray dress, though clean and pressed, showed the careful mending of someone making every thread count. 3 months, another voice chimed in. Samuel Morrison, the feed store owner. 3 months since poor Thomas passed, and look at her, keeping that store open like nothing happened. It ain't proper for a woman alone. Maybe if certain people paid their accounts on time, I wouldn't need to keep it open. Lillian's voice rang out clear and steady, though Wallace caught the slight tremor underneath. Thomas may be gone, but the debts aren't, Mr. Morrison. Or have you forgotten the $40 you still owe? Morrison's face flushed red as Arizona clay. "Now see here." "No, you see here." Lillian stepped forward, and the crowd instinctively moved back. "I've got bills to pay and a life to live. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, I suggest you shop elsewhere. Though good luck finding another place that'll extend you credit after the way you left Jim Bailey hanging last winter." The accusation hung in the air like dust after a stampede. Wallace found himself leaning forward in his saddle, oddly captivated by this display of backbone in a world that preferred its widows weeping and helpless. "Mark my words." Martha Henderson's voice rose shrilly. "No good comes from a woman forgetting her place. That store'll fail within the month. And then, where will you be? Should have sold out to Mr. Halt when he offered. At least then you'd have maintained some dignity." At the mention of Marvin Halt, Wallace's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The banker's son had been circling struggling businesses like a buzzard since his return from San Francisco 6 months ago, buying them up for pennies on the dollar. The fact that he'd already set his sights on the Shaw store didn't bode well. "I'd rather lose everything than sell to that." Lillian bit off whatever word she'd been about to use, her mother's training apparently winning out even in extremity. "Then sell to Mr. Halt, now, if you'll excuse me. I have inventory to manage." She turned on her heel and walked back into the store, the bell above the door chiming with a finality that seemed to dismiss the entire gathering. The crowd began to disperse, their tongues still wagging but their show over for the evening. Wallace sat motionless on his horse, watching the golden light from the store windows spill onto the darkening street. Through the glass, he could see Lillian's silhouette moving among the shelves, her movements quick and purposeful, as if work could keep the wolves of gossip at bay. He'd known Thomas Shaw, though not well. A good man, quick to laugh and slow to judge, who'd come west with dreams bigger than his constitution could support. The consumption had taken him just as the spring rains finally came, leaving behind a young wife and more debts than assets. It was an old story in the territories, common as tumbleweeds and just as easily dismissed by those who hadn't lived it. But there was something about the way Lillian had stood her ground that nagged at Wallace, like a pebble in his boot. Maybe it was the way she'd refused to bow to the town's expectations. Or maybe it was something in her eyes, a familiar kind of loneliness that recognized its own kind. "You planning on sitting there all night, McCain?" The voice startled him from his reverie. Jake Sullivan, the town sheriff, stood beside his horse, thumbs hooked in his gun belt and a knowing look in his eye. "Just passing through, Jake," Wallace replied, gathering his reins. "Uh-huh." Jake spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Word of advice, friend, that there's a hornet's nest best left unpoked. The widow Shaw's got enough troubles without adding yours to the mix." Didn't realize watching was a crime. It ain't, but getting tangled up in town politics might as well be. That woman's got more pride than sense, and pride makes enemies faster than anything in these parts. Wallace touched the brim of his hat. "Appreciate the concern, Sheriff, but like I said, just passing through." As he rode toward the livery stable, Wallace couldn't shake the image of Lillian Shaw standing alone against the town's judgment. He'd spent years building walls around himself, keeping his distance from the petty dramas and entanglements of Cedar Falls. It had served him well, this self-imposed isolation. Safe, predictable, empty. The livery was run by old Pete, a freed slave who'd fought with the Buffalo Soldiers before a Comanche arrow convinced him to find a quieter line of work. Pete was one of the few people in town Wallace considered a friend, mainly because the old man knew how to appreciate silence. "Evening, Mr. McCain," Pete greeted, taking the mare's reins. "Staying in town tonight?" "Thinking about it. How's business?" Pete shrugged, beginning to unsaddle the horse with practiced efficiency. "Can't complain. Well, could, but wouldn't do no good. You hear about the dust-up at the Mercantile?" "Caught the tail end of it." "Mm-hmm." Pete's hands never slowed in their work. "That Lillian Shaw, she's a fighter. Reminds me of my Sarah. God rest her. Course, Sarah knew when to fight and when to bend. Not sure Mrs. Shaw's learned that particular wisdom yet." Wallace pulled out his tobacco pouch, taking his time rolling a cigarette. "You think she'll make it the store? I mean..." Pete considered this as he began brushing down the mare. "Depends on what you mean by make it. Will she keep the doors open? Maybe, for a spell. Will this town let her live in peace while she does it? That's another question entirely." The truth of it settled heavy in Wallace's chest. He'd seen it before, the way small communities could turn on those who didn't fit their narrow definitions of proper behavior. Like his own past, when success in the silver mines had transformed him overnight from friend to target, teaching him hard lessons about human nature and the price of visibility. "You know," Pete continued, his voice casual as he worked. "She's been making do with next to nothing. Stove in the back barely works. Roof leaks something awful when it rains. Thomas, bless him, was always going to fix things next month. Well, next month never came for him. And now she's trying to bail out a sinking ship with a tin cup." Wallace found himself calculating costs in his head new stove. Roof repairs. Probably needed fresh inventory too if Thomas had let things slide while sick. It would be easy enough to help. Anonymously, of course. A few strategic purchases. some conveniently found supplies. He caught himself and almost laughed. Here he was, already planning interventions for a woman he'd never properly met, based on one display of courage and a pair of tired but defiant eyes. Jake had been right, this was a hornet's nest better left alone. "I'll take a room at the hotel tonight," Wallace said, crushing out his cigarette. "Mare threw a shoe on the way in. Don't want to risk the ride home in the dark." It was a lie, and from Pete's expression, not a particularly convincing one. But the old man just nodded. "I'll have her ready by morning. You might want to stop by the Mercantile, though, Mrs. Shaw keeps the only decent coffee in town, and the hotel's brew tastes like they strained it through a dirty sock." Wallace smiled despite himself. "That bad?" "Worse. I use it to strip rust off horseshoes." The hotel was exactly as Wallace remembered it, faded grandeur trying to maintain its dignity in a town that had never quite lived up to its founder's ambitions. The lobby smelled of old cigars and older dreams, and the clerk behind the desk looked like he'd been there since both were new. "Room for the night," Wallace said, signing the register with his usual economical scrawl. "Yes, sir. Mr. McCain. Number 7 is available, overlooking the street. Will you be wanting dinner sent up?" "No, I'll find something myself." The room was clean, if Spartan, with a window that did indeed overlook the main street. From here, Wallace could see the front of Shaw's Mercantile, its painted sign barely visible in the gathering darkness. As he watched, Lillian emerged, locking the door behind her before making her way down the street toward the modest residential area where he knew she lived, a small cottage on the edge of town that Thomas had been so proud of providing for his bride. She walked with her head high, ignoring the few people still on the streets who made a point of looking away as she passed. There was something magnificent and terrible about that solitary figure. Like watching a lone tree standing against a storm, it couldn't possibly survive but refused to acknowledge. Wallace turned away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, pulling off his boots. Tomorrow, he told himself, he'd resupply and head back to his ranch. Let the town sort out its own problems. He had cattle to tend, fences to mend, a life carefully constructed to avoid exactly this kind of complication. But as he lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Cedar Falls settling into night-distant laughter from the saloon, a dog barking somewhere, the creak of wood adjusting to the desert's temperature drop, he couldn't stop thinking about Lillian Shaw's straight spine and tired eyes. Couldn't stop calculating what it would take to shore up a failing business without anyone knowing where the help came from. Most of all, he couldn't stop remembering what it felt like to stand alone against a world that had already made up its mind about who you were and what you deserved. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its cry echoing off the canyon walls like a question posed to the stars. And somewhere in Cedar Falls, 2 lonely people lay awake in their separate darkness, neither knowing that fate had already begun weaving their stories together with threads as fine and strong as spider's silk. The desert had a way of stripping things down to their essence: rock, sand, survival. But sometimes, in the spaces between heartbeats, it also revealed possibilities that comfort and convention would never allow. Wallace McCain had come to town for supplies. What he'd found was something far more dangerous and infinitely more valuable a reason to care. And in a life built on isolation and secrets, that might have been the most terrifying discovery of all. The morning came harsh and bright, as desert mornings do, cutting through the hotel room's thin curtains like a blade. Wallace McCain dressed with his usual efficiency, but his movements carried an unusual hesitation. He'd made his decision somewhere between sleeping and waking he would resupply and leave town. Whatever drama was unfolding around Lillian Shaw was none of his concern. But first, coffee. Pete's warning about the hotel's brew proved prophetic when Wallace took one sip of the black sludge and immediately set the cup aside, which meant, despite his best intentions, he'd be visiting Shaw's Mercantile after all. The town was already stirring as he made his way down the street. Merchants sweeping their storefronts, Freight wagons beginning their daily commerce, the constant dance of civilization trying to maintain its foothold in a land that preferred wildness. Wallace nodded to those who acknowledged him, his expression carefully neutral, projecting the same steady indifference that had served as his armor for years. The mercantile's door stood open to catch the morning cool, and Wallace could hear movement inside boxes being shifted, the scratch of pencil on paper. He paused at the threshold, struck by an unexpected moment of uncertainty. In all his years of self-imposed isolation, he'd forgotten the simple awkwardness of human interaction beyond the purely transactional. "We're open," Lillian's voice called from somewhere among the shelves. "Though, if you're here to gawk or gossip, I'll thank you to move along." Wallace stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "Just need coffee, ma'am. Heard you carry the only decent beans in town." Lillian emerged from behind a stack of grain sacks, a ledger in one hand and a pencil behind her ear. In the morning light, he could see what the evening shadows had hidden: the dark circles under her eyes, the sharp angles where prosperity had given way to mere survival. But her gaze was steady as she took his measure, professional despite the wariness. "Mr. McCain," she said, a note of surprise coloring her voice. "I didn't expect... that is, you don't usually come to town midweek." "Ranch business," he replied, the lie comfortable as an old coat. "Fence wire snapped. Need to repair it before the cattle figure out they can wander." She nodded, moving behind the counter with practiced grace. "Coffee's over here. Just got a shipment from San Antonio. How much do you need?" "5 pounds should do." As she measured out the beans, Wallace found himself studying the store's interior. Pete had been right about the state of things. Water stains on the ceiling spoke of that leaking roof, and the pot-bellied stove in the corner listed to one side. Probably hadn't drawn proper in years, but everything was clean, organized with an almost fierce precision that spoke of someone fighting entropy with everything they had. "That'll be $2, Lillian said, tying off the bag with efficient movements. Wallace paid, noting how her fingers lingered on the coins as if reassuring herself they were real. As she made change, the store's bell chimed, and 3 women entered in a cluster, their voices dying as they saw Wallace at the counter. "Ladies," Lillian greeted them, her tone cooling several degrees. "What can I help you with today?" The eldest, a pinch-faced woman Wallace recognized as Reverend Carmichael's wife, sniffed audibly. "We're here for the church's monthly order, though I must say, Mrs. Shaw, after yesterday's display—" "Your order's ready in the back," Lillian interrupted smoothly. "Same as always. Would you like to inspect it before I load it?" The tension in the small space was thick enough to cut. Wallace should have left, taken his coffee and gone. But something made him linger, examining a display of penny candy with feigned interest. "Actually, Mrs." Carmichael continued, her voice taking on that particularly vicious tone some people reserved for moral instruction. "We've been discussing whether it's appropriate for the church to continue patronizing an establishment run by a woman of questionable—" "Careful, ma'am." The words were out before Wallace could stop them, spoken in the same quiet tone he'd once used to warn claim jumpers away from his stake. All eyes turned to him, and he straightened from his casual pose, every inch the rancher who'd survived 15 years in country that killed the careless. Man chooses his words poorly when he or she speaks ill of someone trying to make an honest living. He touched the brim of his hat to Lillian, whose eyes had widened in surprise. "Mrs. Shaw, I'll need some of that wheat flour, too. 20 pounds, if you've got it." The church ladies exchanged glances, clearly recalibrating their approach in the presence of a witness, and not just any witness, but a man whose good opinion, while rarely given, carried weight in the community. "Of course," Lillian managed, her voice steady though color had risen in her cheeks. "I'll have to get that from the storeroom." "No rush, I'll wait." The standoff stretched for another moment before Mrs. Carmichael huffed. We'll return later, when you're less occupied." The three women departed in a rustle of righteous indignation, the bell jangling violently in their wake. Wallace and Lillian stood in the sudden quiet, neither quite meeting the other's eyes. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "Didn't do anything but order flour." A smile ghosted across her face, there and gone like a desert rain. 20 pounds is a lot of flour for a bachelor rancher. I've got a powerful hunger for biscuits. That earned him an actual laugh, short but genuine, and Wallace felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. When was the last time he'd made someone laugh, not the polite chuckles of social convention, but real mirth pulled from someone who needed it? "I'll get your flour," Lillian said, but she paused at the storeroom door. "Mr. McCain. Thank you." While she was gone, Wallace let himself truly look around the store, beyond the obvious repairs needed. He could see the small touches that spoke of pride and care, hand-lettered signs with prices clearly marked. Goods arranged to best advantage. The floor swept clean despite the morning's traffic. On the wall behind the counter hung a photograph of Thomas and Lillian Shaw on what must have been their wedding day, both young and shining with hope. He was a good man. Wallace turned to find Lillian had returned, following his gaze to the photograph. "We came out here with such plans," she continued, setting the flour on the counter. "Thomas said the territory was where a man could make something of himself, where the past didn't matter as much as the future you were willing to work for." Her voice carried no self-pity, just a quiet acknowledgement of dreams deferred. He didn't count on consumption following us west. "I'm sorry for your loss," Wallace said, the formal words inadequate but necessary. "Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't pay the bills or stop the tongues from wagging." She straightened, that steel spine reasserting itself. "But I don't mean to burden you with my troubles. Mr. McCain, that's 22 pounds of flour at 8 cents a pound, plus your coffee comes to $3.76. Wallace paid without haggling, though he knew the price was fair regardless. As he gathered his purchases, he found himself reluctant to leave, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the red in her hair, or how her hands moved with such determined grace despite everything working against her. "Mrs. Shaw," he said, then stopped, unsure how to continue. What could he offer that wouldn't sound like charity or condescension? "Your roof needs work before the monsoons come." She stiffened. "I'm aware of my roof's condition. Thank you." "Didn't mean to overstep. I know a man in Tucson. Owes me a favor. He could do the work cheap, maybe even on credit if—" "Mr. McCain." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I appreciate what you did with Mrs. Carmichael, truly, but I won't be anyone's charity case. Not yours, not anyone's. I've had my fill of men thinking they know what's best for me." The words stung more than they should have, reminding Wallace why he'd chosen isolation in the first place. Easier to stand apart than risk the complications of connection. "No charity intended," he said stiffly. "My apologies." He was almost to the door when her voice stopped him. "Wait." He turned to find her twisting her wedding ring, a gesture that seemed unconscious. "I spoke harshly. You were trying to help, and I'm not used to kindness without strings anymore." She met his eyes directly. "But I meant what I said. I'll make it on my own, or not at all. It's all I have left my independence. Do you understand?" Wallace thought of his own closely guarded autonomy. The walls he'd built between himself and the world after betrayal had taught him the cost of trust. "Yes, ma'am. I understand better than you might think." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of kindred spirits shaped by loss and determined never to be vulnerable again. Then Wallace touched his hat and left, the bell chiming his departure like a period at the end of a sentence. Outside, the morning had progressed toward the punishing heat of midday. Wallace loaded his purchases onto his horse, very aware that he'd bought far more than he'd intended and would now have to figure out what to do with 20 pounds of flour. But that was a problem for later. Right now, he needed to get back to his ranch, back to the simple, uncomplicated life he'd carved out of solitude and stone. He was adjusting the load when he heard raised voices from the bank across the street. Marvin Holt stood on the boardwalk, his city clothes marking him as sharply as a brand, speaking with two men Wallace recognized as local ranch hands down on their luck. "Simple business proposition. Boys," Holt was saying, his voice carrying that particular oily quality of a man who'd never met a dollar he didn't want to possess. The widow Shaw can't hold out much longer. Already had to refuse credit to half the town. When she finally admits defeat, I'll need men to help. Transition the inventory. Could be some extra pay in it for fellows willing to help a lady see reason. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Wallace's hands stilled on the rope he was tying, every instinct screaming at him to mount up and ride away. Not his business, not his problem. But then he remembered Lillian's straight spine and tired eyes, the way she'd laughed at his joke about biscuits, how she'd spoken of independence like a drowning person speaks of air. "Hank, Jim," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the street. "You boys looking for work?" The two ranch hands turned, surprise evident on their faces. Wallace McCain rarely spoke to anyone he didn't have to, and never offered work to men he hadn't personally vetted. "Yes, sir, Mr. McCain," Hank replied eagerly. "Things been tight since Mr. Morrison let us go. I've got fence work needs doing. $1 a day plus grub. Start tomorrow if you're interested." It was generous pay for fence work, and all three men knew it. Holt's face darkened as his potential conspirators jumped at the better offer. "We'll be there, Mr. McCain," Jim said quickly. "First light." First light, as the two men hurried off, discussing their good fortune. Holt sauntered across the street, his smile as false as fool's gold. "Wallace McCain," he said, extending a hand that Wallace didn't take. "Don't believe we've been properly introduced. Marvin Holt. I handle some of my father's banking interests." "I know who you are." Holt's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Then you know I'm a man who appreciates good business." That was quite generous. Offering those boys work almost seems like you were trying to prevent them from taking honest employment elsewhere. "Nothing dishonest about fence work." "No, indeed. Just as there's nothing dishonest about offering to buy out a failing business before its owner loses everything." Holt adjusted his string tie, the gesture somehow managing to be both casual and threatening. "The widow Shaw's a proud woman, I'll give her that, but pride doesn't pay bills or put food on the table. Sooner or later, she'll have to face reality. Seems to me she's facing it just fine." "Is that so?" Holt's smile widened. "Tell me, McCain, what's your interest in the lovely Mrs. Shaw, bachelor rancher like yourself, maybe thinking it's time to acquire some companionship, though I'd have thought a man of your apparent means could aim higher than a shopkeeper's widow." The insult was calculated, designed to provoke. Wallace had seen enough barroom brawls to recognize the setup, and he wasn't about to give Holt the satisfaction. "My interest is in good coffee and fair prices," he said evenly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a ranch to run." He mounted his horse with deliberate calm, but Holt wasn't finished. "You know, McCain, I've been curious about you. Man lives out here all these years, keeps to himself, never seems to hurt for money despite running a modest operation. Makes a fellow wonder what other enterprises might be funding that comfortable solitude." The probe was subtle, but unmistakable. Wallace's past wasn't exactly secret, but he'd worked hard to let it fade into the background noise of territorial history. Having someone like Holt sniffing around could complicate things considerably. "Wonder all you like," Wallace said, touching his spurs to the mare's flanks. "It's a free territory." But as he rode out of town, he could feel Holt's calculating gaze following him, and he knew with the certainty of a man who'd survived by reading danger signs that he'd just made an enemy. Worse, he'd revealed a vulnerability, his interest, however reluctant, in Lillian Shaw's fate. The ride back to his ranch gave him plenty of time to curse his own foolishness. He'd spent years cultivating invisibility, and in one morning, he'd undone it all. For what? A woman who'd made it clear she wanted nothing from him but his business. Yet, as the familiar outline of his ranch buildings came into view, Wallace couldn't shake the memory of that moment of connection in the store, the recognition of one guarded soul to another. He'd told himself he was content with his isolation, that the wealth hidden beneath his floorboards was worth more than any human connection. But contentment and happiness were two different things, and for the first time in years, Wallace McCain found himself wondering if he'd confused the former for the latter. That night, as he sat on his porch watching the stars emerge in the vast territorial sky, he thought about Lillian Shaw preparing for another day of fighting off creditors and gossip. He thought about Marvin Halt's oily smile and calculating eyes. He thought about the weight of secrets and the cost of isolation. And somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled lonely, defiant, and utterly wild, just like the two souls in Cedar Falls who didn't yet know they were already bound by threads too strong to break. The weeks that followed took on a pattern Wallace hadn't intended but couldn't seem to break. Every few days, he'd find some reason to ride into Cedar Falls running low on coffee again, needed more nails, remembered he required tobacco. The excuses grew thinner with each trip, but he continued making them, drawn by something he refused to name. The mercantile became a familiar refuge from the harsh sun and harsher gossip. Wallace would enter to find Lillian wrestling with inventory, balancing ledgers, or dealing with difficult customers, always maintaining that careful balance between courtesy and steel that seemed to define her. Their conversation started small weather, cattle prices, news from Tucson, but gradually deepened like water carving through stone. "You're back again, Mr. McCain," she said one afternoon, not looking up from her ledger. "At this rate, you'll have enough coffee to supply the entire territory." "Horse kicked through the fence again," he offered, though they both knew his mare was too well trained for such behavior. "Needed more wire." "Third time this week your horse has kicked through a fence." A smile played at the corner of her mouth. "Perhaps you should consider a different horse, or stronger fences." He found himself smiling back, a sensation still foreign after years of practiced indifference. "Perhaps I should." It was during one of these visits that fate intervened in the form of a wounded creature and shared compassion. Wallace had just entered the store when he heard Lillian's sharp intake of breath from the back room, followed by, "Oh, you poor thing. How did this happen to you?" He found her kneeling beside a wooden crate, peering at something inside. As he approached, he could see what had captured her attention, a wolf pup, barely old enough to have its eyes fully open, with its left front leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Found it by the loading dock," she said without looking up. "Something must have attacked its mother. The rest of the pack is gone." The practical thing would be to put the creature out of its misery. Wolves were predators, competition for ranchers, and an injured wolf pup had virtually no chance of survival. But something in Lillian's expression as she gently examined the animal's injuries stopped Wallace from saying so. "Let me see," he said instead, crouching beside her. The pup whimpered as he carefully felt along the injured leg, but didn't try to bite too weak or too young to have learned proper fear of humans. "Bones not broken through the skin." He diagnosed, "Clean break. Might heal straight if it's set proper." "You know how to do that." "Had to learn. Cattle and horses don't always wait for a veterinarian to wander by." He sat back on his heels, studying her face. "Are you planning to keep it?" She looked down at the pup, which had fixed its golden eyes on her face with that particular trust only the very young possess. "I suppose I'm not being practical. Am I? Thomas always said I was too soft-hearted for my own good." "Nothing wrong with a soft heart," Wallace heard himself say, World's got plenty of hard ones already." Their eyes met across the injured animal, and something shifted in the air between them. Without further discussion, they worked together to treat the pup, Wallace setting the leg with practiced efficiency, while Lillian held the creature still, murmuring soothing nonsense that seemed to calm all three of them. "There," Wallace said, tying off the makeshift splint. "Give it 6 weeks. Might have a chance. Course, you'll have to hand feed it for a while. And wolf pups need—" "I'll manage," she interrupted, that familiar steel entering her voice. "I've gotten rather good at nursing lost causes." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning beyond the immediate situation. Wallace cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how close they were kneeling together, how her hair smelled faintly of lavender despite the store's earthier scents. I have some old blankets at the ranch. For bedding, I could bring them by." "That would be kind. Thank you." As he stood to leave, she caught his sleeve. "Mr. McCain Wallace, why do you keep coming here, really?" He could have deflected, made another excuse about supplies or chance. Instead, surprising himself with honesty, he said, "Because for the first time in 15 years, I find myself looking forward to something." The admission cost him vulnerability, scraping like sandpaper against defenses built through hard experience. But Lillian's expression softened in a way that made the discomfort worthwhile. "I'm glad," she said simply. It's nice, having someone to talk to who doesn't look at me like I'm either a scandal or an opportunity." From that day forward, their relationship evolved beyond merchant and customer. The wolf pup, which Lillian named Brave despite Wallace's observation that it was an optimistic name for a creature that still couldn't stand, became an excuse for longer conversations. Wallace would stop by to check on the animal's progress, bringing scraps of meat from his ranch and staying to help with the feeding. "He's getting stronger," Lillian observed one evening as the pup attempted to stand on its splinted leg. "Look at him fight." "Stubborn creature." Wallace agreed. "Won't admit when it's beat." "Sounds familiar," she said with a sideways glance that made him chuckle. These moments of levity became precious oases in lives that had known too much drought. Wallace found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone about his youth in Missouri. His first terrifying cattle drive, the beauty of a desert sunrise after a sleepless night watching for raiders. In return, Lillian painted pictures of her childhood in Ohio, her love of books, how Thomas had courted her with wildflowers and terrible poetry. "He wrote a sonnet comparing my eyes to buckeyes." She laughed, the sound bright as water in the desert. "I never had the heart to tell him buckeyes are poisonous." "Man in love says foolish things," Wallace observed, then felt heat rise in his face at the implication. But Lillian just smiled, a knowing look in those definitely not poisonous eyes. "Yes, I suppose he does." Not all their interactions were so light. The town's pressure on Lillian continued unabated, and Wallace witnessed several instances that made his hands clench with suppressed anger. One afternoon, he arrived to find Marvin Halt leaning against the counter, too close to Lillian for propriety or comfort. "Very generous offer, Mrs. Shaw, more than the business is worth. If we're being honest, you could take the money, start fresh somewhere else. Maybe California. I hear San Francisco is very accepting of independent women." "I've told you before, Mr. Halt, the store is not for sale." Lillian's voice was steady, but Wallace could see the white knuckles where she gripped the counter. "Everything's for sale, dear lady. It's just a matter of finding the right price, or the right pressure." Halt's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Be a shame if your remaining suppliers heard you were having trouble paying their bills. Might decide to take their business elsewhere. Is there a problem here?" Wallace hadn't meant to intervene so directly, but the words came out low and dangerous, shaped by protective instincts he'd thought long dead. Halt turned, his expression shifting to false bonhomie. "McCain, We were just discussing business. Nothing that concerns you. Mrs. Shaw's a friend. The word felt strange on his tongue, but right in his heart. Her concerns are mine. Is that so? Halt's eyes glittered with malicious interest. How touching. The hermit rancher has found a cause. Or is it something else you've found? Lillian stepped between them before Wallace could respond. Mr. Halt was just leaving. Weren't you? Of course. But do think about my offer, Mrs. Shaw. These protective arrangements have a way of complicating things. He touched his hat mockingly. Good day to you both. After he left, the store felt smaller, tainted by his presence. Wallace watched Lillian's shoulders slump momentarily before she forcibly straightened them. How long has he been pressuring you? Since the day after Thomas's funeral, she admitted. He's like a vulture, circling and waiting. And he's not wrong, suppliers are getting nervous. I've had to pay cash up front for the last 2 shipments. And my reserves. She trailed off, pride preventing the completion. Wallace wanted to offer help, could feel the words pushing against his teeth. He had more than enough hidden away to solve all her problems. But he remembered her fierce independence, her declaration that she'd make it on her own or not at all. Instead, he said, Brave's looking stronger every day. Survivors got a way of surprising people who count them out too early. She looked at him then, really looked, and he wondered if she could see past his careful facade to the man underneath scarred, wealthy, and increasingly desperate to matter to someone again. Yes, she said softly, they do. That evening, Wallace stayed later than usual, helping her reorganize the storeroom heavy work that prompted her to protest and him to ignore her protests. They worked in companionable rhythm, and Wallace found himself marveling at how natural it felt, like pieces of a puzzle finding their fit. You know, Lillian said, stretching her back as they finished. I used to dream about adventure when I was young, read every dime novel about the West I could find. Brave pioneers, noble cowboys, ladies finding freedom on the frontier. She laughed, but it had a bitter edge. They never mentioned the loneliness, or how freedom can feel like falling when there's no one to catch you. Not falling, Wallace said quietly. Flying. Just takes a while to learn the difference. She studied him in the lamplight, and he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. You say that like someone who knows. Maybe I do. He picked up his hat, needing the ritual of departure to break the intensity of the moment. I should go. Ranch doesn't run itself. Wallace. His name on her lips stopped him at the door. Thank you for today. For all of it. He touched his hat brim, not trusting his voice, and stepped out into the cooling evening. The ride home passed in a blur of thought and feeling, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats unable to calm the storm in his chest. He was falling for Lillian Shaw. Despite every wall he'd built, every lesson learned about the cost of caring, he was falling like a man who'd stepped off a cliff and only just realized he'd forgotten how to fly. Back at his ranch, Wallace sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey, watching the stars emerge. Somewhere in town, Lillian was probably feeding Brave, fighting her own battles with grace and grit. The wolf pup would heal, he was confident of that now. Its leg would mend straight and strong, and someday it would have to choose between the wild it was born to and the safety of the woman who'd saved it. Wallace understood that dilemma better than he cared to admit. He'd chosen the wild once, chosen isolation and independence over the risk of connection. Now, for the first time in 15 years, he wondered if he'd chosen wrong. A coyote howled in the distance, not the same as a wolf's cry, but close enough to make him think of survivors and second chances. Tomorrow, he'd find another excuse to go to town. Maybe Lillian would smile at one of his poor attempts at humor. Maybe Brave would take another wobbling step toward recovery. Maybe Wallace McCain would continue his own slow journey back from the wilderness of the heart. guided by auburn hair and eyes that saw straight through to the truth of him. The territory night wrapped around him like a blanket, vast and full of possibilities, and for once, that didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. The storm that had been building for weeks finally broke on a sweltering Thursday afternoon. Wallace had just finished helping Lillian move several heavy barrels when they heard the commotion outside, angry voices rising above the usual street noise, punctuated by the crash of breaking glass. Lillian rushed to the door, Wallace close behind. A crowd had gathered across the street, their face twisted with the particular ugliness of mob righteousness. At their center stood Marvin Halt, his usually pristine appearance slightly disheveled but his smile triumphant. "What's happening?" Lillian asked old Pete, who stood at the edge of the gathering. The livery owner's weathered face was grim. "Halt's been spreading stories. Ma'am, says he's got proof you've been, entertaining gentlemen callers after hours. For money." The blood drained from Lillian's face. "That's a lie." "Course it is," Pete agreed. "But truth ain't got much weight when folks want to believe the worst." Wallace felt rage build in his chest like steam in a boiler. He'd seen this before, the way small towns could turn virtue into vice with nothing more than whispered insinuation and pointed fingers. "Come now, Mrs. Shaw." Halt's voice carried across the street, pitched to reach every ear. "No need for denials. We all understand a widow must make ends meet however she can. Though I must say, I'm disappointed you refused my honest offer of purchase in favor of other arrangements." "You bastard!" Lillian breathed, starting forward, but Wallace caught her arm. "Don't," he warned quietly. "That's what he wants. Make a scene, lose your dignity, prove his point." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Her voice cracked with frustration. "Stand here while he destroys what's left of my reputation." Before the Wallace could answer, someone threw a rock. It sailed through the mercantile's front window with a crash that seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. Then, as if that were a signal, the crowd surged forward. "Shame!" someone shouted. "No decent women left in this town. Close your doors, harlot." More rocks followed, and Wallace moved instinctively to shield Lillian as glass showered the boardwalk. He could feel her trembling against him, though whether from fear or fury he couldn't tell. "Inside," he ordered, guiding her back through the door as more projectiles struck the building. Once inside, Lillian pulled away from him, her face a mask of controlled devastation. She walked to the broken window, staring out at the dispersing crowd with eyes that held no tears, something worse than tears. "They win," she said flatly. "Halt wins. I can't fight this. Once a woman's reputation is questioned." She laughed bitterly. "Thomas would be so ashamed." "Thomas would be proud." Wallace countered firmly. "You've fought harder than anyone could expect." "For what?" She gestured at the damaged storefront. "To end up exactly where Halt wanted me, desperate enough to sell for whatever he offers." Wallace's decision crystallized in that moment, born of rage and protectiveness and something deeper he still couldn't name. "You're not selling to Halt." "I don't have a choice anymore." "Yes, you do." He moved to face her, hands carefully at his sides when what he wanted was to cup her face and make her see what he saw. "You said you wouldn't be anyone's charity case. Fine, then be my business partner." She blinked, confusion temporarily displacing despair. "What?" "I need someone to manage supplies for the ranch. Inventory, ordering, bookkeeping. You'd run it from here. Keep the store open. Strictly business arrangement." The lie came smooth as silk, a lifetime of protecting his secrets, serving him now and protecting her. "Wallace, you don't need I need someone I can trust," he interrupted. "Someone who knows the suppliers, understands quality, won't cheat me blind. That's you, unless you'd prefer Halt's offer." She studied him for a long moment, and he wondered if she could see through his fabrication to the desperate need to help underneath. "What about them?" She nodded toward the street. being associated with me won't do your reputation any favors." "My reputation?" He almost smiled. "Mrs. Shaw, I'm a hermit who talks to cattle more than people. Can't damage what doesn't exist." That drew a watery laugh from her. "You're not a hermit. You're just selective." "Then I'm selecting to offer you a legitimate business arrangement. $20 a month plus a percentage of what you save me through smart purchasing. Yes or no?" She was quiet for so long he thought she'd refuse. Then, straightening that backbone he'd come to admire, she extended her hand. "Partners, then." He shook her hand, trying to ignore how right her fingers felt in his. "Partners." Brave chose that moment to hobble out from the back room, his splinted leg making an awkward rhythm on the floor. The young wolf surveyed the damage with intelligent eyes before limping to Lillian and pressing against her skirts. "At least someone's loyal," she murmured, stroking the pup's head. "Won't be the only one." Wallace promised, and meant it. The next few days tested that promise. Wallace made good on his word, publicly announcing their business arrangement in the saloon where he knew it would spread fastest. The reactions ranged from skepticism to outright hostility, but Wallace weathered them with the same stone-faced indifference that had served him for years. More challenging were Halt's escalations. The banker's son didn't take defeat well, and he had resources beyond mere gossip. "McCain," Sheriff Sullivan said, appearing at Wallace's ranch on a dust-hazed morning. "We need to talk." Wallace continued mending the harness he was working on. "So talk." "Marvin Halt's been making noise about you. Says a man who lives this modest but never seems to hurt for money might bear investigating, suggesting maybe the territorial authorities should look into your finances." Wallace's hands never paused in their work. Man can suggest whatever he likes. "Damn it! Wallace! I'm trying to help you here!" Jake removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "I know you've got history. Hell, half the territory's got history they'd rather forget. But Halt's got connections in Tucson, maybe even Phoenix. He pushes this." "Then I'll deal with it." "And Mrs. Shaw, you planning to deal with what he'll do to her, too?" That made Wallace look up. "What do you mean?" "Come on, you ain't that naive. You've publicly aligned yourself with her. In Halt's mind, that makes her the weapon to use against you. Already heard talk about investigating her husband's death, suggesting maybe it wasn't consumption that killed him." The harness leather creaked in Wallace's tightening grip. "Thomas Shaw died of consumption. I was there for the funeral. Same as everyone. You and I know that. But truth's got a way of bending when money's involved." Jake replaced his hat. "Just watch your back. Both of them." After the sheriff left, Wallace sat in the gathering dusk, calculating odds and options. He'd hidden his wealth successfully for 15 years, but that had been when no one was looking. If Halt brought serious scrutiny, he could run, pack up what mattered, disappear into the territorial vastness, start over somewhere else. It's what he'd done before. But that would mean leaving Lillian to face Halt alone. The thought was intolerable. Over the following days, Wallace found himself spending more time in town, ostensibly overseeing his new business arrangement, but really standing guard against whatever Halt might attempt. The merchant community remained split, some shunning Lillian entirely, others warming to her now that she had Wallace's implicit protection. "Don't know why you bother with that woman, Mrs." Henderson sniffed when Wallace passed her on the street. "Nothing good comes from associating with her type." "And what type is that, ma'am?" Wallace asked mildly. "The type who pays her debts and runs an honest business, or the type who refuses to bow and scrape when bullies come calling." The banker's wife huffed and hurried away, but Wallace caught several approving glances from others who'd overheard. Inside the mercantile, he found Lillian teaching Brave to fetch a ball, the wolf pup's progress remarkable despite his healing leg. "He's getting too comfortable with people," Wallace observed. "Won't be able to return to the wild if he gets too tame." "Maybe the wild isn't where he belongs anymore." Lillian replied, not looking at him. Maybe he's found something better. The weight of unspoken meaning hung between them. Wallace cleared his throat. How's business? Better. Your arrangement has given some people permission to shop here again. Though I suspect that has more to do with your glowering at anyone who speaks ill of me than with any business partnership. I don't glower. You're glowering right now. He consciously relaxed his face, which made her laugh a sound that seemed to brighten the damaged store. Wallace, she said, growing serious. What you're doing, I'm grateful, but I don't want you to suffer for helping me. If Halt makes good on his threats, let me worry about Halt. You can't protect me from everything. Watch me. The words came out more intensely than he'd intended, and Lillian's eyes widened. For a moment, the air between them crackled with possibility. Then the store's bell chimed, breaking the spell. A stranger entered, a well-dressed man with a look of city authority about him. I'm looking for Mr. Wallace McCain, he announced. Wallace stepped forward, every instinct on alert. I'm McCain. The man produced a leather folder. Theodore Marsden, Territorial Tax Authority. I'm here about some irregularities in your financial records. Mr. McCain, I'll need to see your books, all of them. Behind the taxman, Wallace glimpsed Marvin Halt lounging against a post outside, his smile visible even from a distance. The battle had escalated, and now Wallace would have to decide protect his secrets or protect Lillian. As Marsden waited expectantly, Wallace made his choice. Some things, he realized, were worth more than all the silver in Arizona. My books are at the ranch, he said calmly. You're welcome to examine them, though I should warn you, my record-keeping is pretty basic, simple rancher and all. Marsden's expression suggested he'd expected more resistance. I see. Well, I'll need to begin immediately. Mr. Halt suggested there might be discrepancies. I'm sure he did. Wallace replied. Mrs. Shaw, I'll be back tomorrow. Don't let Brave eat all the jerky while I'm gone. She nodded, worry clear in her eyes, but said only, be careful. As Wallace led Marsden out, he passed Halt, pausing just long enough to say quietly, You want to come at me? Fine, but leave her out of it. Halt's grin widened. But where would be the fun in that besides? From what I hear, you've made it clear she's under your protection. That makes her fair game in my book. Wallace's fist ached to wipe that smile away, but he forced himself to keep walking. Violence would only give Halt more ammunition. As he rode toward his ranch with Marsden following, Wallace considered his options. His official books would pass inspection, he'd been careful about that. But if they dug deeper, if they found the hidden safe, the silver certificates, the proof of his wealth, well, he'd cross that bridge when he came to it, for now. All that mattered was keeping Lillian safe from the storm he'd helped bring to her door. Behind them, the sun set over Cedar Falls, painting the sky the color of blood and promise, and in the mercantile, a woman and a wolf pup waited, both survivors hoping that trust, once given, wouldn't prove to be their downfall. The morning of the confrontation dawned clear and merciless, the kind of desert day that offered no comfort to those seeking shadows. Wallace had spent the night preparing not with weapons or legal documents, but with the kind of mental fortification a man needs when he's about to step willingly into a trap. Theodore Marsden had found nothing in his official books, of course, but Halt wouldn't stop there, and Wallace knew the real battle was yet to come. He arrived in Cedar Falls to find the main street unusually crowded for a weekday morning. Word had spread, as small-town word always did, that something momentous was brewing. Merchants lingered outside their shops. Wives found reasons to pause in their errands. And even the saloon had opened early to accommodate those seeking liquid courage for the coming spectacle. At the center of it all stood Marvin Halt, dressed in his finest suit, holding court outside the bank like a prince among peasants. McCain, he called out as Wallace dismounted. Good of you to join us. I was just explaining to these fine folks about the importance of transparency in business dealings. Wallace said nothing, tying his horse with deliberate calm. He'd learned long ago that silence unnerved men like Halt more than any threat. You see, Halt continued, raising his voice to ensure everyone heard, when a man lives beyond his visible means, it raises questions. When that same man suddenly takes interest in a desperate widow, well, one wonders about motivations. The only desperation I see, Wallace said evenly, is yours. Halt must sting, being refused by a woman you thought had no choice but to accept. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Halt's face darkened, but his smile remained fixed. Careful, McCain. Slander's a serious charge. Truth isn't slander. Truth, Halt laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. Let's talk about truth then. The truth about where your money really comes from. The truth about why a successful silver miner would hide out here, pretending to be something he's not. The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Wallace saw Lillian emerge from the mercantile, Brave limping beside her, her face set in lines of determination. You want to do this here? Wallace asked. Now. Unless you'd prefer to slink away again. Run like you did from Tombstone when your partners met their unfortunate ends. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Wallace felt the crowd's mood shift, curiosity curdling into suspicion. This was Halt's real weapon, not facts, but insinuation, letting people's imaginations paint darker pictures than reality ever could. My partners died in a cave-in, Wallace said clearly. Along with 12 other men. I survived because I was hauling water when the shaft collapsed. But you know that. Halt, just like you know I bought out their claims legal and proper from their widows. So you say, convenient, being the only survivor. Even more convenient that the claims turned out to be worth a fortune. Wallace saw his trap now. Saw how Halt would twist every truth into suspicion. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the morning air. That's enough. Lillian stepped forward, moving through the crowd like a ship through water. She carried herself with a dignity that made her patched dress look like queenly robes. And when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that came from facing down worse things than public shame. Mr. Halt, you've spent weeks spreading lies about me. Now you're doing the same to Mr. McCain. I wonder what that says about a man who can only elevate himself by tearing others down. Mrs. Shaw. Halt's tone dripped false concern. I understand you feel obligated to defend your benefactor, but perhaps you should consider how this appears. How it appears, Lillian laughed, the sound bright and sharp. Let me tell you how things appear to me. I see a man who offered to buy my store for a fraction of its worth the day after my husband's funeral. When I refused, you began spreading rumors about my virtue. When Mr. McCain showed me simple kindness, you attacked him too. She turned to address the crowd, her voice growing stronger. You all knew Thomas. You knew he was a good man who paid his debts and treated everyone fairly. When he died, I tried to continue that legacy. And how was I repaid with whispers and stones and shame for the crime of surviving? Wallace watched her with something approaching awe. This wasn't the desperate woman he'd first seen being hectored by the crowd. This was someone who'd found her steel in the forge of adversity. Pretty words, Halt sneered. But they don't change facts. McCain's hiding something, and when I prove it— You'll prove what? Wallace interrupted. Decision crystallizing. That I made money in silver, that I chose to live quietly instead of flaunting wealth. Since when is that a crime? So you admit it, you are wealthy. I admit I'm comfortable. More comfortable than I let on. He looked around the crowd, meeting eyes that quickly slid away. 15 years ago, I learned what happens when people know you have money. Friends become parasites. Family becomes strangers. Everyone wants a piece of what you've earned. He stepped closer to Halt. So yes, I've lived modest, kept to myself, bothered no one, until I saw this town turn on a good woman for no crime beyond refusing to buckle under. And you know what? That told me everything I needed to know about where to place my trust. Your trust? Halt's voice rose triumphantly. Then you won't mind if I share what else I've discovered about certain payments you've been making, anonymous donations to widows and Tombstone monthly bank drafts that suggest guilt more than generosity. Wallace felt the trap close. Yes, he'd been sending money to the families of men who'd died in the cave-in. Not from guilt, but from solidarity he'd survived while they hadn't. And his fortune felt heavier knowing their children went hungry. You investigate my charity now? He asked quietly. I investigate suspicious patterns, like a man who hides his wealth suddenly taking interest in a failing business, unless... Halt paused dramatically. There's more between you and Mrs. Shaw than business, perhaps something that started even before poor Thomas passed? The implication was clear and ugly. Wallace saw Lillian's face drain of color, saw the crowd lean in with eager malice. This was the moment Halt had been building toward, not just destroying their reputations separately, but binding them together in scandal. You poisonous little... Wallace, don't! Lillian's hand on his arm stopped him from lunging forward. He's not worth it. Listen to your woman. McCain. Halt taunted. Though I wonder what Thomas would think, knowing how quickly his widow found comfort in another man's arms. The silence that followed was deafening. Wallace could feel the crowd holding its collective breath, waiting to see blood. Lillian stood straight beside him, chin up despite the tears threatening her eyes. And in that moment, Wallace McCain made the choice that would define the rest of his life. You want the truth? Halt, fine. Here's truth. He raised his voice to carry to every ear. I've got more money than this entire town combined. Made it honest in silver, invested it smart, could buy and sell your father's bank twice over. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Halt's eyes glittered with triumph. But Wallace wasn't done. And you know what I did with that fortune I hid? Like a coward, afraid of fortune hunters and false friends. I buried myself out here, convinced alone was safer than connected. He looked at Lillian, letting her see the truth in his eyes. Then I met a woman who faced poverty with more courage than I'd ever faced wealth, who stood tall when this town tried to break her, who showed me that being alive and being living aren't the same thing. He turned back to the crowd. You want scandal? There's your scandal. A rich hermit too scared of his own shadow to live proper until a shopkeeper's widow showed him what real strength looks like. If that makes me foolish, so be it. But any man who says a word against Mrs. Shaw's honor will answer to me. And now you all know I've got the resources to make that answer stick. The threat landed like a hammer on anvil. Wallace McCain had just revealed his secret and weaponized it in a single breath. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably, calculations changing now that the hermit rancher had transformed into a financial power. You think money changes everything? Halt sputtered. No, Wallace replied calmly. But it does change how much attention I can bring to your affairs. Halt, like those loans your father's been calling in early, or the water rights you've been acquiring through dubious means, or your interesting relationship with certain territorial judges. Halt went pale. You can't prove... Can't I? You're not the only one who can hire investigators. Difference is, mine are already working. So here's my offer, leave Mrs. Shaw alone, leave me alone, or find out just how uncomfortable I can make your life. The standoff stretched taut as telegraph wire. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone started clapping, slowly, deliberately. Old Pete pushed forward. His weathered face creased in a smile. About time someone stood up to you. Halt, he declared. And ma'am. He turned to Lillian. Thomas would be right proud of how you've carried on. My Sarah always said you were quality folk. One voice of support became 2, then 5, then a dozen. Not everyone there would always be those who fed on scandal, but enough to show that the tide had turned. Halt looked around, seeing his support evaporate like morning dew. This isn't over, McCain." "Yes," Wallace said simply. "It is." Halt retreated, his dignity in tatters and his schemes in ruins. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with the kind of excitement that came from witnessing history in the making. Wallace and Lillian stood alone in the street, Brave between them, the morning sun casting long shadows. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Expose yourself like that. Risk everything." "Yes, I did." He turned to face her fully. "Lillian, She stopped him with a finger to his lips. "Not here. Not with half the town still watching. But Wallace," her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Thank you for seeing me as worth defending." "You defended yourself," he corrected. "I just provided support." "Partners," she said with a watery smile. "Partners," he agreed, though the word felt inadequate for what sparked between them. As they walked toward the mercantile together, Brave limping proudly between them, Wallace felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the lightness that came from laying down a burden carried too long. He'd kept his wealth secret to stay safe. But safety, he was learning, was just another kind of prison. And sometimes, the only way to truly live was to risk everything for someone worth more than all the silver in Arizona. Behind them, the good people of Cedar Falls watched and whispered and wondered. But for the first time since he'd arrived in the territory, Wallace McCain didn't care what they thought. He was too busy walking toward his future, measured in steps beside a woman who'd taught him that courage wasn't about standing alone. It was about choosing who to stand with. The transformation of Cedar Falls didn't happen overnight, but like desert flowers after rain, change bloomed in unexpected places. In the week following the confrontation, the town seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would come of Wallace McCain's dramatic revelation. For Wallace, the most immediate change was the constant stream of visitors to his ranch, not the fortune seekers he'd feared, but townspeople suddenly eager to make amends. He bore their awkward apologies with stoic patience, though he drew the line when Mrs. Henderson arrived with a niece who would make such a wonderful wife for a wealthy man. "I appreciate the thought," he told her dryly, "but I've got all the companionship I need." The real work, however, was happening at the mercantile. True to his word, Wallace had begun the process of settling Lillian's debts, though not in the heavy-handed manner of a benefactor throwing money at problems. Instead, he worked with her as a genuine partner, reviewing accounts and negotiating with creditors. "I can't accept this," Lillian protested when he showed her the ledger cleared of red ink. "It's too much." "It's business," Wallace countered, though they both knew it was more. "Consider it an investment. The store's profitable when it's not drowning in debt." She studied him across the counter, afternoon light catching the gold flecks in her eyes. "And what return are you expecting on this investment, Mr. McCain?" "A functioning supply chain for the ranch," he said, then added more quietly, "and maybe the chance to see you smile without worry shadowing it." The smile she gave him then was worth more than all the silver he'd ever pulled from the ground. But the peace was fragile, and Marvin Holt hadn't simply vanished. He'd retreated to lick his wounds and plan his next assault, this time targeting Wallace's newfound vulnerability, his connection to Lillian. The attack came sideways, as cowardly moves often do. Wallace arrived at the mercantile one morning to find Lillian kneeling beside Brave, the wolf pup whimpering in obvious distress. "What happened?" "Someone threw poisoned meat over the back fence during the night," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "If I hadn't heard him retching—" Wallace examined the pup, relief flooding through him as he realized Brave had expelled most of the poison. The wolf would survive, though he'd be weak for days. "Halt," Lillian said. Not a question, but a statement. "Can't prove it," Wallace replied, though he shared her certainty. "But this won't stand." The incident galvanized something in the community. Perhaps it was the cowardice of targeting an innocent animal, Or maybe the town had finally reached its limit with Halt's manipulations. Whatever the reason. When Sunday came, Reverend Carmichael delivered a sermon on wolves in sheep's clothing that had Halt's few remaining supporters shifting uncomfortably in their pews. More practically, a letter arrived from Tucson that week, not for Wallace or Lillian, but for the town itself. It came from Margaret Westwood, a widow who'd left Cedar Falls years before after similar persecution. Sheriff Sullivan read it aloud in the saloon, where most of the town had gathered. To the people of Cedar Falls, I write this knowing many of you will remember me, though perhaps not fondly. When my husband died, you made it clear that a woman alone was an aberration to be corrected or cast out. I chose casting out, and found in Tucson what I could not find among you: acceptance and opportunity. I now run one of the territory's most successful millinery shops, with 3 employees and contracts supplying shops as far as California. I write not to boast, but to inform you that I have been corresponding with Mrs. Lillian Shaw, whom I understand faces similar prejudices. Should Cedar Falls continue to make life untenable for Mrs. Shaw, I am prepared to offer her a full partnership in my business. The territory is wide, and there are places where a woman's worth isn't measured solely by her marital status. I hope my former neighbors will prove they've grown wiser in the intervening years. But if not, know that Mrs. Shaw has options beyond your small minds and smaller hearts. Margaret Westwood. The letter had the effect of a stone thrown into still water. Suddenly, the potential loss of the mercantile and Lillian became real to those who'd taken both for granted. "Can't lose the mercantile," muttered Sam Morrison, the same man who'd hectored Lillian weeks before. "Where else would we get supplies without traveling to Tucson?" "Maybe you should have thought of that before throwing stones," old Pete observed tartly. The tide of public opinion, already turning, now became a flood. Within days, the mercantile saw more business than it had in months. Orders that had been mysteriously delayed were suddenly filled. Credit that had been denied was extended, and several prominent citizens made public apologies for misunderstandings. Wallace watched it all with mixed feelings. "Funny how the threat of inconvenience moves hearts faster than appeals to decency," he observed to Lillian one evening. They were sitting on the bench behind the store, watching Brave chase rabbits with increasing agility as his leg healed. The sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and the desert air carried the scent of sage and possibility. "I don't need their approval," Lillian said. "Not anymore. What matters is—" She paused, seeming to gather courage. "Wallace, what are we doing?" "Watching your wolf terrorize rabbits." "You know what I mean." She turned to face him fully. "This partnership, your protection, the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching, where's it leading?" Wallace felt his carefully constructed walls tremble. He'd faced down fortunes and frontier dangers, but this small woman asking for truth terrified him more than any physical threat. "Where do you want it to lead?" he asked finally. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He took a breath, tasting desert dust and dreams. "Lillian, I've spent 15 years convinced that alone was safer, that wealth was a burden best carried in solitude. Then you came along and made me realize I'd confused existing with living." She waited, patient as the stones that knew how to weather storms. "I'm not good at this," he continued. "Words, feelings, letting people close. But I know that when I'm with you, the world makes sense in a way it hasn't since in a long time. I know that your courage humbles me and your smile feels like sunrise, and if Halt or anyone else tries to hurt you again, I'll—" She silenced him with a kiss, soft and sure and tasting of promises. When they parted, her eyes were bright with tears. "I don't need speeches, Wallace. I just need to know if I'm alone and feeling like something broken is finally healing." "You're not alone," he said, pulling her close. "Not anymore. Neither of us." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged. Brave, eventually flopping at their feet with the satisfied exhaustion of a predator who'd forgotten he was supposed to be fierce. The next morning brought unexpected visitors, a delegation of territorial officials, including Theodore Marsden, the tax inspector. Wallace met them at the mercantile, Lillian beside him, prepared for whatever new assault this might represent. But Marsden's expression was unexpectedly sheepish. "Mr. McCain, Mrs. Shaw, I'm here on official business, but not the kind you might expect." He produced a document. "It seems Mr. Marvin Holt has been engaged in certain irregularities regarding territorial bonds and tax assessments." "Imagine that," Wallace said dryly. "Yes, well, your suggestion that we investigate his affairs proved quite fruitful. He's been arrested for embezzlement and fraud. His father is cooperating fully, apparently. He'd grown concerned about his son's activities, but felt powerless to stop him." Lillian's hand found Wallace's, squeezing tightly. "So he's gone." "He'll be enjoying territorial hospitality for the next several years." Marsden confirmed. "I also wanted to apologize for my part in harassing you both. It's clear I was manipulated into serving as a tool for personal vendetta rather than public good." After the officials left, the mercantile erupted in celebration. Customers who'd been lurking outside flooded in, eager to share in the moment of vindication. Even Reverend Carmichael appeared, his wife nowhere in sight. "I believe I owe you both an apology," he said stiffly. "Perhaps especially you, Mrs. Shaw. Christ himself kept company with those society scorned. I forgot that lesson. To my shame." The Reverend's apology opened floodgates. By noon, the mercantile was packed with people seeking either forgiveness or simply wanting to be part of the community's rebirth. Wallace, uncomfortable with crowds on the best of days, eventually escaped to the storeroom where he found old Pete hiding with a flask. "Too much redemption for one morning?" Pete asked, offering the flask. Wallace accepted it gratefully. "Never thought I'd see the day when being proven right felt like such a burden." "Heavy is the head that wears the crown," Pete quoted. "Or, in your case, heavy is the heart that wins the girl and the town's respect in one shot." "Is that what I've done?" Pete's weathered face crinkled in a smile. "Son, I've lived long enough to recognize a love story when I see one. You and Mrs. Shaw, that's the kind of tale folks will be telling long after we're all dust. The question is, what do you plan to do about it?" Wallace looked through the doorway to where Lillian was graciously accepting apologies and orders with equal poise. She caught his eye and winked. A private moment in the public chaos. "I plan," Wallace said slowly, "to do whatever she'll let me do to make her happy." "Well now," Pete chuckled, "that there's the smartest thing I've heard you say yet." As the day wore on and the crowd finally thinned, Wallace and Lillian found themselves alone in the store except for Brave, who'd appointed himself guardian of a ham bone someone had brought as a peace offering. "Quite a day," Lillian said, sinking into a chair. "I never imagined that the town would come around." "That I'd want them to," she admitted. "For weeks, I've been so angry at them, at circumstances, at Thomas for dying and leaving me to face this alone. But today, seeing people genuinely trying to make amends—" "You're a better person than I am," Wallace said. "I'm still half inclined to hold grudges." "No," she said softly. "You're the best person I know. You gave up your privacy, your carefully guarded secrets, all to protect someone who'd given you nothing but a few smiles and conversations." "You gave me more than that," he protested. "You gave me a reason to rejoin the world." She stood and moved to him, placing her hands on his chest. "Then maybe we saved each other." Maybe we did. As they kissed in the lamplit store, Brave looked up from his bone with the air of a chaperone who'd decided his charges were behaving acceptably. Outside, Cedar Falls settled into evening, forever changed by the courage of two people who'd chosen connection over isolation. The territorial newspapers would soon pick up the story, the wealthy hermit and the brave widow who'd faced down prejudice and emerged victorious. It would become legend, embellished with each telling, until the truth was lost in a haze of romance and heroics. But for Wallace and Lillian, the truth was simpler and more profound, two damaged souls recognizing their match, choosing to heal together rather than suffer apart. In a land that tested every form of survival, they discovered the greatest strength of all. Love, it turned out, was worth more than all the silver in Arizona. The dawn came gentle to Cedar Falls that morning, painting the desert in shades of pearl and rose. Wallace McCain stood at the edge of the creek that wound behind his ranch, watching the light dance on the water. In his hands, he held a leather folder containing documents that would change everything: the deed to the mercantile, freshly transferred to Lillian's name free and clear, and papers establishing a trust that would ensure she'd never face financial hardship again. He'd wrestled with the decision all night, not whether to help her, that was never in question, but how to do it in a way that honored her fierce independence while securing her future. "You're up early." He turned to find Lillian approaching, brave, trotting at her heels. The wolf had grown strong over the past weeks, his gait now showing only the slightest hint of his old injury. Like his mistress, he'd healed stronger than before. "Couldn't sleep," Wallace admitted. "Too much thinking." "Dangerous habit," she teased, but her eyes were knowing. "What burden are you carrying now?" Wallace McCain. Instead of answering directly, he handed her the folder. She opened it slowly, her face cycling through confusion, understanding, and something deeper as she read. "Wallace, no. It's already done." "I can't accept this. The store. Yes, that's mine to fight for. But this trust, it's too much. I told you I wouldn't be—" "A charity case," he finished. "I remember. This isn't charity. Lillian, it's—" He struggled for words, then decided on simple truth. "It's me trying to say something I'm not good at saying." She looked up from the papers, tears threatening. "And what's that?" "That I love you. That I want to marry you, if you'll have me. But I also want you to know that regardless of your answer, you'll never have to worry about survival again. Your independence doesn't threaten me. Lillian, it's one of the things I love most about you." The papers fluttered from her hands as she launched herself into his arms, laughing and crying simultaneously. "You impossible, wonderful fool. Yes, of course, yes." Brave, apparently deciding this display of human emotion required supervision, inserted himself between them with a questioning whine. "I think your wolf wants an explanation," Wallace said, still holding her close. "Our wolf," Lillian corrected. "And he'll just have to get used to sharing." They were married a week later, in a simple ceremony by the creek where Wallace had proposed. The guest list was small but meaningful. Old Pete stood as Wallace's best man. Sheriff Sullivan gave Lillian away, and a handful of others who'd proven themselves true friends attended. Even Mrs. Carmichael appeared, having apparently decided that a wealthy marriage made Lillian retroactively respectable. "Don't think this means I forgive her," Lillian whispered to Wallace as they greeted their guests. "But I'm too happy to hold grudges today." "Good policy," he agreed, then lower. "Mrs. McCain." The title sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. The ceremony itself was brief but moving. Reverend Carmichael, perhaps still working off his guilt, gave a heartfelt sermon about second chances and the courage to trust after loss. When Wallace slipped the ring onto Lillian's finger, a simple gold band with a single sapphire that matched her eyes, there wasn't a dry eye among the small gathering. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend announced, and Wallace did so with a thoroughness that had Pete whistling and Mrs. Carmichael fanning herself. The celebration that followed was modest by territorial standards, but rich in genuine warmth. Tables had been set up under the cottonwoods, laden with food contributed by those who'd finally understood what they'd almost lost. Even Sam Morrison had contributed, his donation of premium beef a tacit apology for past sins. As the afternoon wore on, Wallace found a moment to slip away from the festivities, needing a breath of solitude to process the magnitude of change. He found himself at the old pine that overlooked the valley, the spot where he'd often come to think during his years of self-imposed isolation. "I thought I'd find you here." Lillian joined him, her wedding dress practical blue cotton rather than impractical white, already showing signs of the day's celebration. Brave followed, carrying what looked suspiciously like someone's dinner roll in his mouth. "Sorry," Wallace said. "Old habits." "Don't apologize. I fell in love with a man who needs his quiet moments. I'm not looking to change that." She slipped her hand into his. "Though I do hope you'll let me share some of them." "All of them, if you want." They stood together watching the sun lower toward the horizon, painting their valley in shades of gold and amber. Below, they could hear laughter from their guests, the sound carrying on the clear air like a blessing. "Any regrets?" Lillian asked softly. "Only one," Wallace admitted. "That I waited so long to let you in." "You weren't ready before. Neither was I." She leaned against his shoulder. "Thomas was a good man, and I loved him, but what you and I have, it's different, deeper. We've both been broken and rebuilt ourselves. That creates a bond that easy love could never match." Brave, apparently deciding the moment needed his input, dropped the dinner roll and howled a sound that started uncertain but grew in strength and confidence. Within moments, answering calls echoed from the distant hills, wild cousins acknowledging one of their own. "He's calling to his kind," Wallace observed. "Letting them know he's still wild at heart, even if he's chosen a different path." Lillian said, "Sound familiar?" Painfully so. As they made their way back to the celebration, Wallace reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. From a man so isolated he'd forgotten how to smile, to a husband surrounded by community. From a woman facing destitution and shame, to a bride secure in love and fortune alike. The evening brought speeches and toasts, some eloquent, others fumbling but sincere. Pete's was particularly memorable. "I've known Wallace McCain near about 10 years. The old soldier began, swaying slightly from the whiskey. "In all that time, I never saw him smile real until until Lillian came along. And I watched this lady face down a whole town with nothing but backbone and determination. Separate, they were admirable. Together," he raised his glass. "Together, they're unstoppable. To the McCains." The toast was echoed enthusiastically, and Wallace felt something loosen in his chest, the last of his old fears finally releasing their grip. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, each taking a moment to offer personal congratulations or renewed apologies, Wallace and Lillian found themselves alone, except for Brave, who'd stationed himself on the porch as if guarding the newlyweds. "Home?" Wallace asked, the word taking on new meaning now. "Home," Lillian agreed. They'd decided to split their time between the ranch and the quarters above the mercantile, at least until they could build proper living space at the store. It was a practical arrangement that also felt symbolic, bridging Wallace's solitary past with their shared future. That night, as they lay together in the quiet of the ranch house, Lillian traced patterns on Wallace's chest and asked, "What now?" "What do you mean?" "We've slain our dragon's halt, the town's prejudice, our own fears. What comes next?" Wallace considered this. "Living, I suppose, running the store and the ranch, maybe expanding, if you want. Pete mentioned the stagecoach line is looking for a new depot location." "Always the businessman," she teased. "But I meant for us. Who do we become now?" "Ourselves," he said after a moment. "Just together." She smiled against his shoulder. "I like that plan." Outside, Brave howled again, and this time the wild answers seemed closer, as if the desert itself was welcoming their union. Wallace pulled Lillian closer, marveling at the warmth of another person choosing to share his life, his bed, his future. "I love you," he said, the words still feeling new and precious on his tongue. "I love you too," she replied. "My secretly wealthy rancher who watched me be shamed by the town until he made me his wife." That's a mouthful for a title. Then we'll just have to live a story worth the telling. As sleep claimed them, Wallace's last thought was of transformation, how a man could live 42 years thinking he knew himself, only to discover he'd been incomplete all along. Lillian had shown him that wealth meant nothing without someone to share it with, that independence didn't require isolation, and that the greatest courage was in allowing yourself to be vulnerable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The store would need running. The ranch required attention, and there would always be those in Cedar Falls who resented their happiness. But tonight, with his wife in his arms and their guardian wolf on the porch, Wallace McCain was complete in a way all the silver in Arizona could never have made him. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and constant, witness to another love story in the long history of the territory. And somewhere in the sage-scented darkness, a wolf with a healing heart sang to the moon, wild and domestic in perfect balance, proof that even the broken could choose wholeness. In Cedar Falls, the impossible had become reality. A widow had kept her independence while gaining security. A hermit had kept his solitude while gaining companionship. And two souls had discovered that the greatest treasure in the West wasn't gold or silver or land. It was finding someone who saw you truly and chose to stay. 5 years had passed since Wallace and Lillian McCain exchanged vows by the creek, and Cedar Falls had transformed as surely as the desert blooms after rain. The mercantile now occupied 3 storefronts, having expanded to include a grain depot and the territory's first lending library, Lillian's particular pride. Above it all, freshly painted in gold letters, the sign read, "Shaw and McCain, honest goods, honest hearts." "You sure about keeping Thomas's name on there?" Wallace had asked when they'd commissioned the new sign. He was part of the journey. Lillian had replied simply, "Without him, I'd never have come west, never have found you. The past shapes us. Wallace, we honor it best by building on it, not erasing it." Now, standing before that sign on a crisp autumn morning, Wallace reflected on how prophetic those words had been. The town that had once whispered poison about a struggling widow now looked to the McCains as pillars of the community. It hadn't happened overnight, trust. Once broken, heals slowly but consistent kindness and fair dealing had worked their quiet magic. "Papa, papa." The young voice pulled Wallace from his reverie. 3-year-old Sarah McCain came running down the boardwalk, her auburn curls so like her mother's, bouncing with each step. Behind her, moving at a more dignified pace, came Lillian, carrying their infant son, Thomas. "Brave caught a rabbit," Sarah announced breathlessly. "But Mama made him give it back." "Did she now?" Wallace scooped his daughter into his arms, marveling as always at how this tiny person had completed their family. And what did Brave think of that? "He looked sad, but Mama gave him jerky instead, so he's happy now." Over Sarah's head, Wallace met Lillian's eyes. 5 years of marriage had only deepened the connection between them, creating a private language of glances and half-smiles. "Brave's getting too domesticated," Lillian said, shifting baby Thomas to her other hip. "Though I suppose we all are." "Nothing wrong with a little domestication," Wallace replied, setting Sarah down. "Long as we remember where we came from." They entered the store together, the familiar scents of coffee, leather, and grain enveloping them like an embrace. Behind the counter stood their newest employee, young Marcus Fletcher, one of the boys Wallace had hired away from Halt years ago, now grown into a responsible man with a family of his own. "Morning, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCain," Marcus greeted them. "That shipment from Tucson arrived, also Mrs. Westwood sent another letter." Margaret Westwood had become a regular correspondent and business partner, their alliance proving profitable for both enterprises. Her letters often contained more than business. However, gossip from the territorial capital, news of political changes, and occasionally updates on former Cedar Falls residents who'd moved on. Lillian took the letter while Wallace reviewed the shipment manifest. Sarah, with the attention span of her age, wandered off to find Brave, who maintained a cushioned throne in the corner of the store where he could survey his domain. "Oh my," Lillian said suddenly. "What is it?" "Marvin Halt. He's dead. Died in prison last month. Says here he caught fever and never recovered." Wallace felt a complex mix of emotions, not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of cosmic justice, perhaps. His father, still running the bank, apparently. Martha says he's never been the same since the scandal, aged 20 years and 5. They stood quietly for a moment, contemplating how differently things might have gone. Then baby Thomas gurgled, breaking the spell, and life moved on as life does. The morning passed in the pleasant rhythm of commerce. Customers came and went, each greeted by name, their needs anticipated through years of service. Wallace had discovered, somewhat to his surprise, that he enjoyed the merchant life. There was something satisfying about providing what people needed, about being woven into the fabric of daily existence. Around noon, Sheriff Sullivan appeared, but his visit was social rather than official. "Afternoon, folks. Sarah, you helping your parents today?" "I'm teaching Brave to count," Sarah announced. "He knows up to 3. "Impressive," Jake said solemnly. Then to Wallace, "Got a minute, something I want to run by you." They stepped out onto the boardwalk, leaving Lillian to handle a customer asking about fabric. "What's on your mind, Jake?" "I'm thinking of retiring," the sheriff said without preamble. "Been at this job near 20 years. Figure it's time to let younger blood take over. You have someone in mind." "Marcus Fletcher. Boy's got a good head. People respect him, and he knows the value of keeping peace rather than just enforcing law." Wallace considered this. "He's young for it. So was I when I started. Besides, he's got good examples to follow." Jake glanced meaningfully at Wallace. "Town council would listen if you vouched for him." "I'll think on it," Wallace promised. As Jake departed, Wallace realized how much had changed. Once, he'd have rejected any involvement in town politics. Now, people sought his opinion not just because of his wealth, but because he'd proven himself fair and thoughtful. It was a responsibility he hadn't sought but couldn't ethically avoid. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, a travel-worn man who entered hesitantly, as if unsure of his welcome. "Can I help you?" Lillian asked. I'm looking for Wallace McCain. I was told he might be here." Wallace stepped forward. Studying the stranger, something about him seemed familiar, though he couldn't place it. "I'm McCain." The man's shoulders sagged with relief. "Mr. McCain, you probably don't remember me. Daniel Morrison. I worked the Tombstone mine with you. Was there when the cave-in happened." Wallace finished, memory clicking into place. "Danny Morrison. You were just a kid then." 16, Daniel confirmed. You've been sending money to my mother all these years, even after she remarried, moved to California. The bank drafts kept coming." Wallace shifted uncomfortably. That had been meant to remain anonymous. "She died last year," Daniel continued. "But before she went, she told me everything. How you made sure every widow from that cave-in was taken care of. How you never asked for thanks or recognition." His voice broke slightly. "I had to come find you. Had to say what she never could. Thank you." The store had gone quiet, customers and family alike listening to this revelation of another layer of Wallace McCain. "Your mother didn't owe me thanks," Wallace said quietly. "Men died while I lived. Seemed only right to share the fortune that came after." "Still," Daniel straightened, "I needed you to know it mattered. That money put me through school. helped my sisters find good marriages. You changed our lives." After Daniel left with a job offer at the expanded Mercantile if he wanted it, the store remained unusually quiet. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Papa's a hero." "No," Wallace corrected gently, lifting his daughter. "Just a man trying to do right. Real heroes are people like your mama, who stand up when standing up is hard." "Can't we both be heroes?" Lillian asked, moving close with baby Thomas. "Different kinds, maybe, but both necessary." "Mama's right," Sarah declared with 3-year-old certainty. "Even Brave's a hero. He saved a mouse from a snake yesterday." "Did he now?" Wallace asked, grateful for the shift to lighter topics. As the day wound toward evening, the McCain family prepared to close shop. It was their custom to have dinner at the ranch on Saturdays, maintaining connection to the land that had sheltered Wallace through his years of solitude. "Revenue's up again this month," Marcus reported as he helped close out the register. "At this rate, might need to expand again." "Or open a second location," Lillian suggested. "There's talk of a new settlement near the copper finds." Wallace marveled at his wife's business acumen. The scared widow he'd first met had evolved into a sharp entrepreneur who could negotiate with suppliers as skillfully as she soothed scraped knees. They loaded into the wagon a far cry from Wallace's bachelor days of solitary rides. Brave took his customary position as guardian, age having silvered his muzzle but not dimmed his protective instincts. Sarah chattered about her day while baby Thomas dozed in Lillian's arms. As they crested the rise that revealed the ranch, Wallace felt the familiar peace settle over him. The house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, but it maintained the simple lines he'd always favored. Smoke rose from the chimney where their housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, a widow they'd helped establish in town, was preparing dinner. "Home," Sarah announced unnecessarily but joyfully after dinner, as twilight painted the sky purple. Wallace found himself on the porch with Lillian, watching Sarah play with Brave in the yard. Baby Thomas slept peacefully in the cradle they'd moved outside to enjoy the evening air. "Any regrets?" Lillian asked, echoing her question from their wedding day. "None," Wallace replied without hesitation. "You, only that we can't freeze moments like this." She leaned into his embrace. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up and find it was all a dream, that I'm still alone in that store, fighting off creditors and gossip." "Not a dream," Wallace assured her. "Though I understand the feeling. Spent so many years convinced happiness was a luxury I couldn't afford. And now I know it's not a luxury. It's a choice, one we make daily." Brave's howl interrupted the moment. Still strong despite his years, as always, the desert answered, wild voices acknowledging their domesticated kin. "He's telling them about us," Sarah said matter-of-factly, running to her parents. "About how we're a family." "Is that what he's saying?" Wallace asked, pulling his daughter onto his lap. "Yes, he says we're his pack and he's proud of us." "Well then," Lillian said, "we'd better make sure we continue earning that pride." As darkness fell and they moved inside, Wallace reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a man who'd hidden from life to a husband, father, and community pillar. From a woman facing disgrace and poverty to a successful merchant and beloved mother. They'd saved each other in ways neither had expected. The house settled around them with comfortable sounds. Sarah's prayers, Thomas's soft breathing, Lillian's gentle humming as she prepared for bed. Through the window, Wallace could see Brave keeping his eternal watch, guardian of all they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. The store would open, customers would come, life would continue its ancient dance. But tonight, in this home built on honesty and trust, Wallace McCain knew a contentment that all the silver in the world couldn't purchase. "Coming to bed," Lillian called. "Just a moment," he replied, taking one last look at the stars. Somewhere out there, Other souls were struggling as he and Lillian once had isolated. Afraid, convinced that safety lay in solitude, Wallace offered up a silent hope that they too would find their salvation in unexpected connections, in the courage to trust after betrayal, in the discovery that broken things could heal stronger than before. Then he turned from the window and walked toward his wife, toward warmth and love and the future they continued to build one day at a time. Outside, a wolf sang to the desert moon, and the desert, in its eternal wisdom, sang back. The story of the secretly wealthy rancher and the widow he made his wife had become legend in the territory, but for the family living it, it was simply life messy, beautiful, challenging, and worth every moment. In Cedar Falls, where judgment had once reigned supreme, love had written a different ending, and in the sign that swayed gently in the night breeze, Shaw and McCain, honest goods, honest hearts. The truth of it gleamed like gold in the desert sun. And thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and exchange thoughts about this tale. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Night and hit the like button. And don't forget to press the hype button to help more people discover this video. Your support means the world to me.